Good afternoon, Eastern Washington. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from the capital of free Washington, Spokane Valley. Someday, maybe. Liberty State. Brought to you once again by the Committee to Elect Matt Shea, Republican, and the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news. And it's not about right or left, it's about right and wrong. And we need to do the hard work to implement freedom because our hope is not in man, but in Jesus Christ. And we can't end in prayer. We must also move to action. And we need to be the warriors. Exodus 15:3 talks about, if God is our example, the Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. I want to talk really quick today about Liberty State, continuing to move forward. Flag, stickers. We have a lot of different things happening, too, with the website, libertystate.org, libertystate.org, and then also the Facebook page, Liberty State, and Join the 51st State Movement, which has about 3,000 people on it. So if you want to join, you want to get involved, we're looking for county captains that can help organize in the various counties in Eastern Washington, can help spread the news, get flags up everywhere we can possibly get them up, get stickers on every car and business we can get them on, and claim liberty, claim ground for liberty everywhere we possibly can. People are, some people thought that this was a gimmick. It's kind of funny. They thought it was a gimmick. No, this is the real deal. It's what we believe. We already are living as two states. As many of you seen my presentation on the 51st state, we're already living as two states. We have two totally different ideologies, two totally different belief systems and heritage and culture. In particular, our agrarian roots here in Eastern Washington. And we have an understanding, too, that we should be prepared and that we should love our neighbors in a tangible way, and that we just don't wait on government to do things. I was kind of found it funny that the Bernie Sanders supporters they would rail against Goldman Sachs. And then if you ask them, well, aren't a lot of the people that were in Goldman Sachs, haven't they rotated into government, become the bureaucrats? So large government is actually becoming filled with them too. And they don't have really a response to that because their ideology really isn't based in truth. They think that the state is God. We believe there is one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose son is Jesus the Christ. And there is a fundamental difference there. You can't; those two things can't hold. And so a state should best represent the folks in its state. The government, the representatives in government, should best represent the values, traditions, cultures of the people. And if that's not happening, or there's a significant majority, then it's right to split and form a new state that does represent those things. And you know what? It'd be better for Seattle, too. They get their social programs and their Lenin statues, and we aren't going to stand in your way. You guys could do that. You're a new state. You can do that. So why not? I know California's already talking about it. Why not? And that's why I think is behind the 51st state. People already know this reality is happening, and they want to be a part of it. So if you want to get involved, go to those Facebook pages, Liberty State, or go to Join the 51st State Movement. Get involved. Help us form with county captains. Help us to organize as we're going to move this forward as fast as we possibly can, and make sure that we get some local votes on this in the counties, get some resolutions passed, and continue to move this forward for this next legislative session. And that brings us to your daily intelligence briefing on the international front in the Middle East. Like we predicted, the flashpoint of Kirkuk. Well, initially there was war. Iraqi forces stormed the Kirkuk oil fields and occupied, but there was almost no Peshmerga or Kurdish resistance. And apparently the Kurds have agreed to go back to borders, I believe in 1993, and have just given up the oil fields, which is very strange to me because that was their big leverage point. So they must have been some sort of a deal cut. That would be my guess. Also in the Middle East, Raqqa in Syria falls. The capital of ISIS falls. And a lot of those soldiers are now dispersing throughout the world. So what you're going to see happen is similar to what we saw happen at the fall of Baghdad. There was a dispersal of Saddam's military leaders into the countryside. Now, we're going to see with ISIS throughout the world. You're going to see those leaders dispersed throughout the world. So there's going to be quite an influx of attacks, likely, in other parts of the world because of that dispersal. Also on the international front, North Korea threatening again because of U.S. military exercises. One aircraft carrier there, one headed there right now, if it hasn't already arrived. And things they're really eerily quiet. So that tells me there's probably some communications, back channel communications going on behind the scenes, and that maybe they're trying to reach some sort of a deal. But the North Koreans saying they're going to have some catastrophic attacks on the United States yesterday. And that the United States can't imagine what it would be like to be attacked by the North Koreans. Well, eventually, I think these so-called unimaginable attacks, sooner or later, he's either going to have to put up or shut up, and he knows that. And so that's what's a little alarming, is that we're kind of reaching that point. Also on the international front, we talked about the Catalonians. They declared independence, suspended it so that they could have talks with Spain. Spain counters by arresting two of their leaders. And now the Catalonian leader is saying, hey, I guess we are going to have to declare independence. We might see something on Monday, this coming Monday. So keep your eyes open for that in the news. But more importantly, it is spreading now throughout Europe. So you are seeing, like we predicted on this show, and I say we because there's a lot of people that are involved in putting this show on the air, and I get a lot of information from all over the place. But one of my Italian friends talked to me a while back about something called Lega Lombarda, which is a movement in northern Italy, and a very conservative movement in northern Italy. And northern Italy is the more productive part of Italy, similar to Catalonia in Spain. It's the more productive part of Spain. And they are now moving for a referendum on autonomy, apparently, or vote on autonomy here coming up by the end of the month. So we're seeing this independence wave spreading. And it's interesting, too, that some of these regions are the exact regions that banded together way back in the 1400s, the Siege of Vienna, to drive out the Ottoman Turks and the Muslim invaders at that time. So you see this kind of resurgence of these countries. They're almost reclaiming their independence. They're reclaiming their sovereignty. And so it's not just Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's not just the leaders in Poland. But now there's an election where a billionaire conservative may win in the Czech Republic. It's happening everywhere. And we just need to keep this in the forefront, because it's telling us that the trend worldwide is actually to smaller governments closer to the people that more represent the cultures, values, traditions, heritage of the people. Also on the international front, Venezuela. Now, people said this, and our guest today is going to be talking about this. People said this. This would never happen in modern times. There would never be hyperinflation in modern times. Zimbabwe was an anomaly. And we have an oil-rich country in Venezuela that is now going to go toward 2,400% inflation, that has billions due in debt payments at the end of the month. And people are saying, oh, well, I guess it can happen in modern times. Well, and it's socialist policies that brought it to that point. That's what's important to understand. It is socialist policies that have resulted in this hyperinflation. Complete vindication of people that have said this is what happens when money dies as a result of socialist policies that marginalize the productive members of society, stifle the investment of capital, capital being the means of production, and then try to take what productive money there is and redistribute it. That's what happens. And here's another example. Also on the international front, this sonic attack in Cuba was recorded. And there's a couple outlets that have this, but apparently was recorded. Liberty News Daily is bringing us this part of it, but it's just amazing. This was recorded, and there may be more people that are victims. So some sort of sonic weapon in Cuba. Now there's a recording of it. So there's more information coming out about this. We're going to continue to follow it because if the Cuban government had something to do with it, that's an act of war if they did it on U.S. Embassy personnel and U.S. citizens. And you're just not hearing a lot about that in the media, but apparently it's recorded. You can actually go online and listen to it yourself. Which brings us to the national front. President Trump talking about debt forgiveness in Puerto Rico, $29 billion of debt forgiveness, okay? We already can't afford, who's next? Illinois? Probably. And it's interesting, too, that the lessons of Puerto Rico, so again, socialist policies, left-leaning policies, bankrupting a U.S. territory, okay? They are bankrupt. They declared bankruptcy back in May. Now they want to have $29 billion in debt forgiveness. Leftist policies, again, collapsing an economy, okay? Another example, but now this is inside the United States of America, which, again, people said could never happen. Now you have Illinois that, although technically can't declare bankruptcy without an act of Congress, is bankrupt because 100% of their revenue is going to pay for their obligations, and they have no leftover, and it looks like their tax increases may not end up covering it. People are fleeing Illinois. Businesses are going to flee Illinois. But Puerto Rico continues to be this lesson, first and foremost. And here's the other lesson. According to Axios, you have the claim down there now that 78% of Puerto Rico is still in the dark weeks after this hurricane struck, and 28% are still without potable water. So you remember the preparedness things we've been talking about. Now we have where we're going on months without electricity, months without potable water. It could never happen in the United States of America, only it has and is continuing down there in Puerto Rico right now. Pay attention to this stuff, folks. There's a lot of people procrastinating out there. Be prepared. Could be a windstorm. Could be a hurricane. Could be rain or flooding. Could be anything. Be ready because it can happen in the United States and has. Where people still don't have electricity weeks later, still don't have potable water. That's almost a third, 28%. Also on the national front, The Economist, I talked about that, issuing a bubble warning. We'll talk about that a little later in the show, but this is an interesting corollary. So The Economist, not a bastion of conservatism, is saying, hey, maybe assets are overpriced. And now The Atlantic, okay, also not a bastion of conservatism, The Atlantic saying that, we need to take a look at land use regulations in America, and The Atlantic saying this. I want to quote the article for you. Okay, this is in this very liberal publication. Okay, when a state like California puts up a lot of regulations on land use, they're depressing economic activity and jobs in the state. Ohanian, a UCLA economics professor, told me. This told me being the author of the article. But they're not just shooting themselves in the foot. They're shooting the country in the foot, too. He estimates that deregulating California and New York alone back to the land use regulation levels of 1980. So understand what that means. That's pre-Growth Management Act, Shoreline Management Act, all these other environmental ridiculous policies that came out in the 90s, too, okay? Back to levels of 1980 would increase nationwide productivity. Now, this is just in 2 states, California and New York, would increase productivity by 7% and consumption by 5%. A separate paper by Moretti and Chang Tai Si of the University of Chicago found that lowering housing regulations in San Francisco, New York, and San Jose to the level of regulation in the average U.S. city would increase GDP by 9.5%. In other words, the average U.S. city not having many. Listen to that, 9.5%, the GDP of the country. So the Atlantic now, a liberal publication, is admitting that all of this Agenda 21/2030 garbage, if it was eliminated, would have a massive positive impact. And in most places, it would be a massive positive economic impact for the poor. And it would allow for massive job creation. Incredible. I posted this up on Facebook. I think it's up on the Patriot Radio Facebook page as well. Check out the article. You can use it with your liberal friends. Since it is a liberal publication, they may listen to it. I don't know. But just goes to prove again that deregulating on the land use side will free up and unshackle the American spirit. On the national front as well, Department of Interior and the BLM freeing up 10 million mineral acres and unwinding sage-grouse regulations. So that's going along the deregulation of land use side. And a lot of people in the West thinking this is a big win, and it's continuing to be some great things we're seeing on the Western land front out of the Trump administration. Also on the national front, Donald Trump, the fewest jobless claims since 1973. That reported on Drudge today. The fewest jobless claims since 1973. On top of that, like icing on the cake, the Department of Defense kicked out the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, a lot of good things still coming out. It's great. I love it. We're going to talk about how is that really showing prosperity or not? And is there some caution that we need to be looking at going forward? Antifa saying that November 4th is going to be the kickoff of its apparently communist revolution. Interestingly, 100 years to the day. No, not to the day. About 3 days less. November 7th, 1917 was the communist revolution in Russia. They want to do November 4th. Is it a coincidence? I don't think so. I'll let you decide. And speaking of Russians and the Russian Revolution, Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, suddenly, The Hill breaking a story that there was Russian collusion, which many of us already had been talking about in regards to uranium sales, and that the FBI had identified, and this is key, had identified kickbacks and bribery going on prior to it being approved. And that some of those same people that were implicated, associated with the Russian oligarchs and government, were directing funds to the Clinton Foundation. This is a huge story, folks, and we're going to continue to follow this. And it's interesting, too. Remember I told you before that the left projects onto others how they really are themselves. So when Hillary Clinton projected on Donald Trump collusion with the Russians, she was covering for what she really was doing herself, apparently, according to this, the implications of this, the Hill article. So just, it's one more example of this phenomenon of projection. So when you see the left project, and they say, for example, somebody's an extremist, they probably are the extremist, based on our definitions. Okay, when they say that somebody is hateful toward other people, they probably are the ones that are hateful toward other people. And that's a psychological phenomenon that you can use in these situations, and it's just a perfect example with this story coming out about possible Clinton Foundation collusion with Russians over this uranium deal, and them tracking the money, and also the FBI saying, hey, we knew ahead of time before it was approved that there had been kickbacks and bribery going on. Wow. Amazing. So check it out on the Hill. Also on the national front, I want to talk about something that I think is kind of regional, but not. We have in America right now a lot of folks saying, why is the government and the government bureaucrats, why are they coming after my business? Why are they coming after my land? And it's becoming more and more clear that you have bureaucrats in government who do not care about the American people. They care about themselves and their agenda. And this explains a lot of what is happening with Donald Trump. A lot of things he wants to do are getting sidetracked, which brings us to where he is making some positive impacts. He's learning how to use executive orders now and to say, hey, listen, this is the official policy administration, and if you don't follow it, then you're giving rise or just cause to be terminated, number one. But number two, taking some things off the table like Obamacare and replacing it with good policy through executive order, through some shrewd maneuvering. And the things that he's using are constitutional. In fact, he talked to Rand Paul and took one of Rand's ideas and is going forward with that in regards to funding of Obamacare. So I really think we need to keep our eyes on how the bureaucratic machine, the deep state, goes against people and goes against not just Trump, but all of us. On the regional front, Ryan and Ammon Bundy transferred to Henderson. Many believe that was a huge win because it's a much better facility. They're being treated much better, as I understand, through all of my contacts and sources. And also, Readout News bringing up a great point that it was reported by the Bureau of Land Management that these were peaceful protests. So what exactly are they being prosecuted for? Great point. And that needs to be run down in the court. I agree. Also on the regional front, probably one of my favorite articles of this week anyway. WSU has a professor named Robert Wielgus, or Wild Goose. And a 2014 study claimed that killing wolves actually increased the number of sheep and cattle that wolves depredate the following year. Okay? So Wielgus said that, no, that's actually not true, that more wolves, okay, more wolves is actually better for the overall ecosystem. The problem is that Washington Policy Center went through this report and said, well, actually, the author's own data disproves his claims. And in fact found that killing wolves actually results in more sheep and more cattle. Okay? In addition to that, when they went through this study, they found that Wielgus's claim of removing wolves, increasing the number of breeding pairs, is also undermined. So, which doesn't make sense. I mean, if you're removing wolves, you're going to have a decreased number of breeding pairs. So these leftist professors do this garbage all the time. They will twist everything into something totally opposite, even though it's rationally not possible. But if you get a chance, take a look at this analysis by the Washington Policy Center and share it with your friends and family, because it really debunks the leftist argument on wolves. We need to start eradicating wolves again in Northeast Washington. On the local front, kudos to the Spokane Valley City Council, helping to bring 150 jobs, and that's just the start. There's other companies that are going to be moving into the industrial park. 150 jobs, Spokane Valley with Katerra, and great job. They're just doing a great job. And if you want the Spokane Valley City Council to remain Christian, constitutionalist, and conservative, keep them in. Don't listen to these chameleon progressives who try to sound like they're conservative and really aren't, and really are pro-taxes, or they get a 0 on We Believe We Vote after a 0 after interviewing on We Believe We Vote. Also on the local front tonight, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the show, Tom DeWeese is going to be here at Center Place at 7 o'clock tonight. Center Place out in Spokane Valley. And Tom DeWeese is going to be talking about Agenda 21/2030, same thing. And it's interesting because I was talking about the Atlantic article and deregulating land use, and Tom is going to be talking about how we can make this a reality in our communities tonight. So if you get a chance, go out to Center Place at 7 o'clock. I look forward to seeing you all there. Also on the local front, October 23rd at Candlelight Christian Fellowship in Coeur d'Alene, 6 o'clock to 8:30, Patriot Academy, having its annual fundraiser. This is the next generation, folks. If you want to support the youth that are going to lead the fight for freedom and liberty in the next 20 years, come to Patriot Academy's fundraiser October 23rd at Candlelight Christian Fellowship in Coeur d'Alene. And that's the briefing. Remember, the antidote to dependency and socialism is to be a God-fearing, self-reliant, freedom-loving American. Thank you to everybody that's been praying for the show. Make sure you go to Facebook/Patriot Radio US. Like the page, share it with your friends and family. And if you want to support the show, you can go to VoteShea, SHEA.com. And send me a note, too. It's just matt@voteshea.com. So send me a note if you get a chance. And let me know what you think about the topics and the guests. And also some testimonials about how you're fighting back against the swamp, how you're draining the swamp in your individual sphere of influence. Well, it's my honor today to finally, after a long time, get my next guest on, Michael Snyder of Economic Collapse blog, author of Living a Life That Really Matters, and a candidate for Congress in Idaho. Michael, it is great to have you on Patriot Radio today. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing really well, Matt. How are you? Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Been reading your stuff for a long, long time. So, but there may be some listeners out there that are not familiar with you. So if you could tell them a little bit about how you became a Christian conservative and one of the most read authors in the United States.
Yeah, well, a number of years ago, I was actually working as an attorney right in the heart of Washington, D.C., and if God can use a former Washington, D.C. attorney, he can use anyone. But I was sitting there, I was working, really disturbed by the corruption I was seeing all around me, and I thought, what in the world can I do? Because in those days, I was about as anonymous as you could possibly be. And I was just getting up in the morning like everybody else, going to work and making a paycheck, trying to pay the bills. And I thought, what in the world can I do? So, I heard about, this thing called blogging. So I started to write. And at first you could have measured my audience with a microscope. And in those days, I was listening to Alex Jones, some other people who were, helping to wake me up. And, I was fired up. But I thought, what can one citizen, one person do? So I started writing. And then at the end of 2009, I started the economiccollapseblog.com. And that really struck a chord because we were just coming out of the financial crisis. People knew they weren't getting straight answers from the mainstream media, and they still aren't. But people were seeking out alternative sources of information. And so the website just exploded. I've launched some other websites. And today, and since that time, my wife and I, we moved, and we live up in Bonners Ferry, Idaho. And over the last 7 years, my websites have been viewed by more than 100 million times. That number still astounds me to this day. And then ultimately, I got the attention of radio and television. I've been a frequent guest, and I've written 4 books. But it just proves the power of the Internet, where it allows someone like me, someone like you, to literally impact people all over the planet. Me and my wife from our little home in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. But literally we hear from people all over the world that we're touching for Jesus Christ, for true conservative values, for freedom, for liberty. And I think the elite are freaking out, Matt, because people like you doing such a great job there in Washington State and with your radio program, people like me, with the websites, we're all working together. We're rising up. We're telling the truth outside of the mainstream media paradigm. And, we're really starting to win the battle for hearts and minds. And I think that the establishment, the elite, are starting to freak out a little bit.
Yeah, I really think they are, because they can't control the spread of the social media. Eventually, they're going to have to crack down on the internet, and they're already kind of trying to start, because they know that the more people we can reach with the facts, the more people are going to realize the truth and not follow their narrative.
Oh, it's absolutely true. And so we've already seen, just since the election, because Donald Trump, he wasn't supposed to win, and the elite are kind of like, how in the world did this happen? So they're cracking down on some alternative media. YouTube is demonetizing people. Google searches are eliminating some websites, and we're seeing this in Facebook and Twitter and some other ways. So we're starting to see a bit of a crackdown where they've, trying to accuse us of being fake news because we don't follow the narrative of the mainstream media. And meanwhile, I love President Trump calling out places like CNN and saying, you're fake news. No, you are the fake news. So, literally we're in a struggle for the heart and soul of this nation moving forward because, obviously the left, the socialists, the establishment, the globalists want to take us one direction. And then those of us that love the Constitution, freedom and liberty and the gospel and, what our founding fathers intended, we want to go a completely different direction. So, some have described it as a civil war. Of course, it's not with guns and bullets at this point. Hopefully it will never become violent, but it is a war, a battle for ideas and insight and values. And, it's a battle we can't afford to lose. And so every generation of Americans has had to stand up and fight for liberty, for freedom, for what they believe. And now it's our turn. And hopefully we won't have to fight with guns and bullets, but we do have to fight for ideas, for values, for what kind of country our children and our grandchildren are ultimately going to be living in.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because right now, if you try to tell the truth on things, and specifically you, when you try to tell the truth on the economy, that things may look kind of rosy right now, but really the underpinnings are in serious jeopardy. If you say something like that, or you try to write about it, you're called a fearmonger, and why do you want to see the United States fail, and all of these things. How do you address that approach to fundamental principles to say, wait, no, I love this country. We actually do want to see the fundamental principles return?
Yeah, and it's a little bit tougher right now because we've been in these boom and bust cycles. In fact, since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, we've had 18 distinct recessions and or depressions, or we've had these artificial booms and busts constantly created by the Fed. And now we're in this boom today, the greatest debt bubble in all of human history. So I point out to people, remember 2008, and things were so bad then, but now our long-term imbalances, our long-term problems, so many of them are so much worse today. For example, you look at the national debt, $10 trillion about back then in 2008. Now we're $20 trillion. We've been adding to it at a rate of more than $100 million an hour, every single hour of every single day since Barack Obama first set foot in the White House. It's what we're doing to future generations of Americans is absolutely criminal, and it's got to stop. But not only that, then you look at corporate debt has doubled since the last financial crisis, much worse position to be in. Consumer debt is almost up to $13 trillion, rapidly approaching that number. And then all over the world, Matt, where the total amount of debt in the world, all-time record high of $217 trillion. We've never seen more debt in all of global history. And, debt cannot grow far faster than the economy indefinitely. At some point when there's a debt bubble and it grows much faster than the overall economy, there's a bursting, and then we have like a 2008 or ultimately what could be much, much worse. And so that's a major, major problem. Meanwhile, while this debt has just been exploding, has our economy been growing? No. In fact, Matt, I went back and I looked at the last 10 years and I added them all together, economic growth for each year, added them all together, divide by 10 to find the average economic growth for the last 10 years. And on average over the last 10 years, it's been 1.33%, which is horrible. And I thought, well, what can I compare this to? So I went back to the 1930s, and I pulled up the economic growth for every year in the 1930s, all 10 years, added them up, divided by 10. You know what I found? I found that it was also 1.33%. I thought, now, that can't be right. How in the world can I come up with the same number for both time periods? So I went back, reran the numbers from scratch, did it again, and found out, yeah, that's right. So our economic growth over the last 10 years has been really, really kind of pitiful. Meanwhile, debt's been exploding. The stock market's been exploding. Why? Not because the economy's doing well, but because of central bank intervention, quantitative easing, even foreign central banks coming in and buying up shares of stock. For example, the Swiss central bank over there, their central bank, during the months of January, February, and March of this year alone, they bought 4 million shares of Apple stock. So, of course, the shares of Apple were going to go up. But they're boosting this artificial bubble, which is just temporary, and at some point is going to burst, just like everyone has throughout human history. And people need to understand the season we're in.
Well, let's talk about that, because people don't believe that it can happen here in the United States. Okay, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, yeah, but it's never going to happen here in the United States because the Federal Reserve can just keep printing money ad nauseum, in ad infinitum, and they just was never going to stop, and therefore they will be able to slow down inflation. They will be able to control the economy, and so it's just never going to be a true threat. What is your response to that?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, we've had a Federal Reserve, for over 100 years, and we've had 18 different recessions or depressions, and many people believe we're on the verge of another one. But it all goes back, today, Matt, more than 99.9% of the world lives in a country with a central bank. So even though we can't get the rest of the world to agree on anything else, more than 99.9% of the population of the world, somehow by some coincidence, has a central bank. Now, central banks are designed to create government debt. They're designed to create inflation. And because ultimately, you go back to 1913, the Federal Reserve, that plan is snuck in right before Christmas, they pulled a fast one on the American people. All of a sudden, we have a central bank. And it was designed by the Wall Street interests to create an endless debt spiral from which we can never possibly escape. Because, when you ask most Americans, where does money come from? They can't even tell you. Well, when money ultimately, most people think, well, the government just prints up money. No, that's not how it works. When the government decides they want money, they say, okay, Federal Reserve, create us some money, and usually it's not paper money, usually it's electronic, but then they exchange that money for U.S. Treasury bonds, and then the Federal Reserve auctions those off. So in that transaction, money is created, but more debt is actually created than the money. Now, the theory is we'll spin that through the economy really quickly and tax it at a high enough rate that eventually will pay off that debt. Of course, that never ends up working in reality, so the government has to go back and ask for more money, and so the debt cycle continues. And that's why, since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the size of our national debt has gotten more than 6,000 times larger, and the value of the U.S. dollar has fallen by more than 98%. And because 99.9% of the world lives in a country with a central bank, we're seeing the same things happen all over the planet, literally, and then you end up with a Zimbabwe or Venezuela or Greece, but the whole world's essentially operating under a similar system, central banking system. So what happened other places can most definitely happen here. Just because we haven't seen total disaster yet doesn't mean it won't happen. All of our long-term problems, debt problems, the derivatives, and we could talk about this for hours, things just get worse and worse and worse as we move along, and people say, well, maybe it's going to be okay. Maybe it's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the red flags are all around us.
Well, and normalcy bias is out there in spades, that things will continue the way they've always continued. But what eventually will call the bluff? Because again, we have Puerto Rico. Trump wants to forgive $29 billion of debt, just pocket change between friends, right? When does the jig finally up? In Venezuela it was up when they ran out of money to print more money, actually print more money. And the jig was up down there too when they realized that they could not fulfill all the promises that they made to the folks. So when do you think it is for America? What do you see in the future?
Yeah, well, we've got a huge problem because we've got a massively aging population where we've got all these baby boomers retiring. And, just if you look in the future, spending on Social Security and Medicare, are projected to double over the next decade. And we're already adding to the national debt. People hear the deficit figure, but we've been adding to the national debt more than $1 trillion a year on average over the last decade. Not all of that counts toward the official deficit, but we've been able to do this because we've been able to borrow trillions and trillions of dollars, from the rest of the world at ultra low interest rates, which are below the rate of inflation. And that's the only reason we've even gotten this far, because if the average rate of interest on U.S. government debt were to even rise to the long-term average of about 5% or so, well, we'd be paying more than $1 trillion a year just in interest on the national debt, and the game would be over. So, the only reason we've even gotten this far is because interest rates have been just so ridiculously low. And a big part of that is because we've got the petrodollar, and everyone around the world uses our currency, and then they reinvest that back into our stock market or buying U.S. treasuries. And so that helps keep interest rates low. So if we ultimately lose the petrodollar, that's why it was so big when Venezuela recently announced they're going to quit taking dollars for their oil and moving away from the petrodollar system. That was huge news. I wrote about it. A few others did, but the mainstream media totally ignored it. But that was huge news. So, we start to see interest rates go up, or, there's many other triggers which could cause it. But people need to understand we're far more vulnerable today to a financial or economic shaking than we've ever been before. But most people, all they do is listen to the mainstream media, because more than 90% of what we get through our televisions is controlled by just 6 giant media corporations I wrote about the other day. And they're telling them everything's going to be fine. Everything is not going to be fine long-term, and our long-term problems are getting worse by the day.
Well, this is Matt Shea on Patriot Radio with Michael Snyder, Economic Collapse blog, also candidate for Congress in Idaho. I want to shift gears a little bit, and, I appreciate you mentioning Jesus Christ, because it is a lot of people say you can't mention it in the political realm anymore, but you're unashamed about that. Your faith plays a big role in who you are. What do you see for this region of America, freedom, faith, and how could you change something in Congress as just one guy? I mean, that's what people always ask me. How can you just one guy change something at the state level? How could you just change with one guy things at the federal level?
Yeah, well, with one person, you can just look at Ron Paul and the enormous influence he had all around the country as one guy. But ultimately, we need more than one guy. And that's why me and my team, we're encouraging people with the platform that I have all over the country for good people to run. And when people are running, we're trying to give them exposure. We're trying to encourage them. And we're ultimately trying to create a network where, as we approach midterm elections, which I believe are going to be the most important in modern American history, where people can go, and ultimately we hope to be working with some people even to create a map. So if you live in New York State or wherever you live, you can click on that map and find who's running that's a patriot, that's a true conservative, that loves the Constitution, that's anti-establishment, and so you can see who to vote for in your area, because it's a national movement. And I'd even promised if I win, if I get to Congress, I'm going to go all over the country and campaign against these rhinos, because every rhino has got to go, and for people that love liberty, love freedom, that want to run on a Ron Paul platform, a Christian platform, because like you said in the lead into the question, I'm an unashamed Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ, and I don't care who hears it. And that's what our founding fathers, our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, they were birthed out of a culture of Bible-believing Christians. And they just escaped tyranny in Europe, and they didn't want anyone telling them how they had to worship. They didn't want anyone telling them, how they had to live their lives. They wanted a society where freedom and liberty are maximized. Instead, what do we have today? Today, literally on the federal level, we got hundreds of thousands of laws, rules, and regulations. And then when you add in state, local, and all the other layers, we literally have millions of laws, rules, and regulations governing our daily lives. This is not what our founding fathers intended. We need to swing the pendulum completely back in the other direction, go to a limited government, limited federal government, and where freedom and liberty are maximized. And that's why I love so much what you've been doing, Matt, because you've been fighting for these things for a very long time. And we need an awakening all around the country, because just one or two people, you can do a little bit. But if we have a movement all over the country, then we're really talking.
Do you think that the forces like Antifa and some of these other things from the contacts you have, because you have probably a lot more contacts than I do you think that those forces are really going to try to stop the movement that has already started? I mean, they were surprised with Trump, but it's continuing, and you're seeing it at the state and local level. At least I am in Washington, and I've heard about some of the stuff going on in Idaho. It really seems like it's like a wave that's just kind of beginning to build. Do you think they're really going to try to stand in front of that and stop us at every point?
Well, I think they do. They're very passionate, and that's why, I'm seeing kind of some apathy. Once Trump won, a lot of apathy on the conservative side, while meanwhile on the far left, they're fired up. And there's Antifa in Boise, and I was even told there's Antifa in Lewiston, where I was last night. I was like, that's crazy. But on November 4th, Matt, they're saying they're starting a resistance, and they're not going to stop. They're never going to stop, is what they're saying, until Trump and Pence are removed from power. That's their single demand, and so they're planning this huge campaign. And Antifa, they, unlike other groups like Indivisible, so others which are causing problems, but Antifa in particular have openly embraced violence. This was reported by The Hill, other mainstream publications, where they're saying, yeah, we believe that, because they literally believe that Donald Trump is a new Hitler, and that those of us that support Trump are basically his brown shirts. And so they're like, well, in order to stop a new Hitler, well, we're willing to do violence. If that's what it's going to take, we're going to embrace that. And so we've seen that already. They're fired up. They're going to do it. But ultimately, that's just one part of the battle. The other part of the battle, ultimately, is Washington, D.C., where you've got the deep state. You've got that, because the globalists have controlled kind of both parties for a long time. And they controlled the government agencies, the structures of government and the intelligence agencies. And the deep state wants to kind of shut down this revolution. They want to get Trump and Pence out. They want to put this fire out and go back to normal. But beyond that, and then kind of just crush this whole thing. But we're seeing some good things, like out in Alabama, Matt, where Roy Moore, they spent more than $30 million to try to defeat Roy Moore, but he still won. Isn't that crazy?
It is. Just unbelievable. I mean, most people don't understand that's how much money the establishment will throw at good, conservative, Christian patriots to get them out of office and keep them out of office.
It's true. And in the old days, it always worked, because whoever raised the most money would almost always win. Incumbents would almost always win. But now it's starting to change. People are waking up. And even though they spent $30 million against Roy Moore, the people said, no, we want Roy Moore. We want anti-establishment candidates. And so we're starting to see these fires all over the country. So this is a golden opportunity for us, Matt. I think the movement, as we've been waking people up, hearts and minds, one at a time, all over the country, now we're getting to the kind of critical mass where, hey, if Donald Trump can become president, anything is possible. If Roy Moore can overcome $30 million from the establishment, anything is possible. And so I think we just need good people to rise up, to run, for us to be united, and with not only the government back, but we need to take back the education system, the judicial system, arts and entertainment, because, like today, most colleges are liberal indoctrination centers. It's just a whole progressive agenda. It's really a cultural transformation, a cultural war we need to transform the way people think, the way that people think about things, to rediscover the Constitution, because the left has been taking us down a certain road for so long, and now we need to reverse direction and start heading back.
Well, let's talk a little bit about foreign policy, because there's also this element kind of hanging out there right now. We've spent trillions in our foreign policy. North Korea is clearly making direct threats to the United States. The constitutional thing would be for the president to bring this before Congress with for a declaration of war if he believed it was that big of a threat. We haven't heard talk that way yet. What is your view on foreign policy and how sometimes foreign policy is actually being used to manipulate American opinion and create maybe crises where there shouldn't be crises or where there isn't crises?
Oh, absolutely. And for decades, presidents have been abusing power because if we're going to go to war, you've got to get the approval of Congress, period. And so that has frustrated me just as a voter for ages. But yeah, at the end of the day, hey, I'm the son of a U.S. Navy veteran. I believe in having a strong military, but we can't be going around all over the place starting wars. We can't be the police of the world. So I'm very much on the same page with Ron Paul like this, in that we don't need to have military bases in every friendly country in the entire planet. Germany can take care of Germany. We don't need to have military bases and forces permanently stationed over there. We can start bringing our boys and girls home. And ultimately, we don't have to get involved in every war on the planet. And, we don't belong in the civil war in Syria. And then North Korea, and I've written about this quite a bit, there's no possible way that a military option over there ends well. In fact, any military option over there is probably going to result in millions of people dead. So hopefully we can find another way to resolve this crisis, because just a military strike, would just open up a Pandora's box, and weapons of mass destruction, which North Korea has, and all, and even just that they got one of the biggest artillery forces on the planet, start raining fire down there on Seoul and potentially even Tokyo. And it just goes on and on. So, yeah, but the neocons, both on the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, war hawks, and a lot of them are surrounding Trump now, which is troubling. But, yeah, the solution to every problem is not always going to war, and we definitely need to change that thinking in Washington.
No question about that. No question at all. I would like to, in the last couple minutes that we have, give you the opportunity to tell people what they can do to prepare if the economy is headed in in a collapse direction, which, by all accounts, I think it is. And also where they can go to get more information about you and also read your blog.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of preparing, a lot of it is just common sense. My wife and I store up food and water and medical supplies and different things we would need in an emergency. Not only, if there's an economic collapse, but if there's a war, if there's, we saw what happens with the hurricanes and everything else. Things happen, and it just makes sense to be physically prepared. Now, the most important preparation is spiritual preparation, and people neglect that often. Getting right with Jesus Christ, making him the center of who you are, that's the most important thing of all. And so, people say, well, Michael, you're very spiritual, but you talk about these practical things too. And I try to blend both together because both are so important. But people in most of your audiences probably already know my website, the economiccollapseblog.com. If you just go to Google and type in economic collapse, it's the first result that comes up. It's the website I'm most known for, and I write about these economic things on a regular basis. And then if you're curious about the campaign, I'm running for Congress here in Idaho's 1st Congressional District. And you can find out more, michaelsnyderforcongress.com. And if you're a big fan of Matt Shea and you read through my issues page, you'll be like, man, he sounds a lot like Matt Shea, because I believe in limited government. I want to abolish the IRS and the Federal Reserve, and I want to transfer power from Washington back to the states, and so many other things. Matt Shea is in favor of, me too, and so I was tickled pink to be invited on the show today. But if you want to learn more, visit michaelsnyderforcongress.com.
All right, in 1 minute, if you have a message to the young people out there listening to Patriot Radio throughout all of eastern Washington, North Idaho, and northeast Oregon, what would that message be to those young folks out there?
I'd be like, get involved. We can change things. Don't listen to mainstream media, which says, don't even bother. One person can't make a difference. One person can make a difference. I'm living proof of that, because I used to be a total nobody, but now, God has graciously opened some doors where I can make a larger difference. And but individually, we can only do so much. Collectively, we can make a massive difference, but we've got to be united, work together. And if we can, look, we got Trump elected, and I believe the future can be much, much brighter if we work together.
Michael Snyder, Economic Collapse Blog, and also, Economic Collapse Blog. I don't know how I got tongue-tied right there. And also candidate for Congress in North Idaho. Thank you very much for joining me on Patriot Radio today. I would love to have you on again, my friend. I really appreciate everything you're doing, and I'd love to get together maybe offline and talk about some of the things that are facing the country.
Anytime, Matt. Yeah, I'd love to come back on anytime, get together with you anytime. Definitely reach out, let me know, because I love your work. So anytime, definitely.
All right. Lord bless you, my friend. And if anybody out there is listening, wants to get involved, again, go check out both of his pages. I'll make sure that I get them put up on Patriot Radio today. Michael Snyder, thanks again. Lord bless you and your family. I know it's a hard road, and I really, really know you're gaining a lot of traction there in Idaho.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
All right. So I will have that up on Patriot Radio's Facebook page here in a little bit, and we're trying out a new file transfer system. For those of you that have been listening to the podcast, we had a problem transferring files. We've got that resolved now, and so we'll be back to the normal thing where the episodes are put up on Friday mornings, and you'll be able to access that on Friday mornings into the future after the Thursday show, and then Wednesday mornings after the Tuesday show. So I just wanted to say that because many people have been asking about the podcast, and I apologize for that. We just had a technological problem. We had to make a much larger workaround than I thought. So thank you all for your patience there. Also want to end the show today. If you get a chance, go check out this article in The Atlantic on deregulating land use so that it helps the poor. It's an amazing article that it would be in that liberal of a publication. And I think it's something you can use to share with some of your more liberal friends, that these are really the facts, that all these land use regulations are getting in the way of productive people. They're getting in the way of investment of capital, the means of production. They're getting in the way of people using their land in the best possible way. And the Hearst decision here in Washington is just one example of that, where you can't drill wells, you can't develop the land, property values plummet, and then also tax revenue plummets toward education, something the liberals apparently didn't see as a tertiary effect, but it is. So if you get an opportunity, read that article and get educated on this, because the tide is turning, because truth always wins out in the end. And right now, a lot of people are looking for the truth, and we need to be prepared to give it to them. Because they look at things and they know something's wrong, but they really can't understand what. And then lastly, go to the economiccollapseblog.com. Check out Michael Snyder's stuff. I've been reading him for a long time. Just a wonderful human being. And if you get a chance and you're in North Idaho, take a look at his issues page. He is a lot like me, because that is the truth, and that's freedom. God bless you all.